it could blow something else up in the amp, like the diodes or whatnot, okay? All right. The other thing you want to do, I mentioned I just clicked my amp on standby. Most tube amps have a standby switch. So when you're not using the amplifier, you click it to standby. So the amp is still on, but it's not going to wear out the tubes because it's on standby. So like when I go on break from playing out, like if in between sets, I click it to standby. If I'm not using it, like right now I'm talking, I click it on standby, and that'll make your tubes last longer. Okay? And one of the last things I wanted to tell you about before we get into other modules about the tube amp that's very, very important, this is probably one of the most important things, is in order to get a really good sound out of your tube amp, you have to crank it. You have to play, you have to get the tubes heated up, and you have to really get them, the voltage running through there, and get them swapping that, talking back to each other, those tubes, right? Your tube amp set on, if you're always playing with your tube amp on 1 or 2, you're not going to get that full, beautiful, lush, warm tube amp sound. You have to crank it, okay? That's another reason why it's so important to know the application as far as for what you need your amp for. Because if there's no sense getting this huge, big tube amplifier just if you're going to sit in your room and play at night, because you're going to have that tube amp on 1 all the time, and you're never going to get the good tube sound out of it. Okay? Tube amps are made, they're actually made to be cranked, because you got to get these tubes.
Sounds like a Ferrari,
exactly.
Man. You got to work that.
You got to work it, exactly. You're not going to buy a Ferrari and
take it 30 miles an hour.
Exactly.
Bring it.
You got to, yeah, exactly. You got to crank it. So these tubes, you have to get them hot. You have to get the voltage running through them, and you have to get them talking to each other. So you really got to crank that. So if you only need a little amp that you're going to be playing on 1 or 2, don't go out, because it'll be a waste of your money.
That makes a lot of sense just for the new people. So you want to get a solid state if you're practicing your room and you're not,
right?
Because you're throwing your money away.
Exactly.
You're not going to get this nice sound in what you're telling.
Right, exactly. If you just need a tiny little amp for your room, you know, you might want to get. It's going to be cheaper. Just get and it's just a practice amp, and you might want to get something which you could plug headphones into. And I'm going to show you solid state amps in a minute. Now, solid state. Now, I'm a big tube amp guy. But like I always say, you have to find out what you like. Go to a music store and play through lots of stuff. The technology has gotten much, much better in the past 5-7 years. So now, before solid state amps, I used to think they were really not nearly as good sounding as tube amps. But now, they're making some solid state amps that sound pretty darn good at affordable prices. And I'll tell you why. There's a reason behind that. With a solid state amp, there's no tubes, okay? So you don't have all that maintenance, and you don't have to replace parts. So and they're cheaper. So there's a lot of advantage to them, and they're going to sound about the same at a lower volume or a higher volume, pretty much, okay? Because you don't have to get them cranked up. Now, there's now what's called modeling out there for amplifiers, where they take solid state amplifiers and they model them to sound like Fender tube amps, or Mesa Boogie tube amps, or matchless amps, or orange amps, or whatever, but they can kind of model the sound of a tube amp in a solid state amp. And that's getting much better, the technology in that, because, you know, years ago, many years ago, in order for someone to take a solid state amp and to change the kind of sound about it and to play with the sound, I'm talking from the manufacturer, they would have to make major hardware changes in the amp. In the power amp section, or the preamp, not in the power amp section, in the major sections to the hardware of the amplifier, okay? And that would make it cost prohibitive for them to put out all these different lines, or all these different models, or all these different effects in the amp like that, because they'd have to make major changes in the hardware. But now, it's changed to where the technology's gotten so good, now it just becomes changes in the software, you see, on these modeling amplifiers. And that allowed them to experiment and put out different ones. And because it's not cost prohibitive for these amp manufacturers anymore to really dial in all the different modeling sounds of these solid state amps, they can get a lot better. And it's a lot cheaper. Whereas before they had to make major hardware changes and retool lines, and it made no sense for them to do that. It was cost prohibitive. So now, changes in the software, and the sounds are getting better all the time. And they're combining, like, there's Valvetronics amps with like 1 tube in it and the rest solid state. Or they'll make a pedal with a tube in it, and the technology is really going crazy, so you got to really experiment and find out what you like. So the stigma before, like solid state amps, they sound terrible. Not so anymore. They sound really, really good. Really good, and they're getting better and better and better. I still prefer the tube amp for my live setup. For my little practice stuff and my teachings when I have students come over who like to play with, because I teach out of my studio, distortion, I plug them into a little solid state amp because they don't have to crank it to get a good sound. Now this up here, this Fender is a tube amp, and we'll talk about that one in another module. But again, the distortion in there does not sound very good unless it's really cranked. So no good if you want to play in your little room or teach and talk above it, right? So don't surpass these solid state amps because they have some solid state amps, and I'm going to play through them in coming modules, and you'll hear they have a lot of advantages. They're cheaper, they don't require maintenance, and you can get a lot of different sounds out of them, and a lot of them have a lot of built-in effects and things like that. So the best thing to do, go to a big music store and play through them all. They'll let you do that. Just sit there. It's like a kid in a candy store, man. I love going to music stores. And the technology is so awesome now. They have so many companies are making all these different kinds and models of amps, and you just got to find what you like, what sounds best to you. Okay? I like Fender. I like Matchless. I like some of the Mesa Boogie line. I generally am torn more toward the tube amps, but that's just me. Okay? Line 6, great solid state company. They make some really killer stuff. And I have a line 6 here that we'll get into in future modules. So remember on your tube amps, change your tubes regularly. Do not wait to the point to when they blow out because you could damage your amp.
Listen for the crackling.
Listen for the warning signs. Listen for the crackling, or listen if you hear your volume surging. Usually it gets less. If you hear that, and you'll hear that because once you start playing out using your amp all the time, you'll know it like the back of your hand. And you hear that. I hear that. I'm like, uh-oh, that could be trouble. And remember, know your application. Don't buy this huge rig made for stage if you're just going to be playing in your room. Makes no sense to waste the money and you're not going to get. Remember with tube amps, you got to crank them. Get that voltage really running through them. Keep them on standby. And find a good amp tech. That's the last thing I wanted to say in this module, okay? I like mom and pop stores for things like that. You know, I found an amp guy here in San Diego. He used to be this electronics whiz. This guy, he kind of has this long frizzy, he's mad scientist
Back to the future.
Yeah, total Back to the Future look to him. But you find a mom and pop guy, and man, these guys are so into it. You know what I'm saying? They're not like, I mean, they're into it. When I go there, and I know my gear pretty well, but he starts talking to me about, hey, I changed the voltage by doing this, and if I use this Russian tube versus this Chinese tube, and hey, I could do that. And he's like taking me, and he wants it, and he's so passionate about it, right? And I had a guy like that when I lived in New Jersey, okay? Mom and pop stores are great for things like that. So you want to find a good amp guy, and a good amp guy can make mods on your amp, and they really know how electronics works and electricity works, and that's huge. So find a good amp guy and have your amp biased, your tube amp biased. Take it in, have them bias it, have them check the tubes, make sure they're not leaking, make sure the amp is running at its peak performance. Okay? And because your tone is you, man. It's so much about a guitar player is their tone, and a lot of that tone is in your hands, like I always say, and in your heart. But you also want to have a good sound coming out of your amplifier. How are you going to take all the beautiful things you're doing with your hands and amplify them if you're playing electric so people can hear it, unless you have an amp that's set up to perform to sound good, okay? So that's just the basics on some things about the tube amp. We're going to do the solid state in a little bit, and we're going to do much, much more on tube amps, but I like to keep these modules 10, 15 minutes and not overload people. That's the ultimate amount of time for modules. Some will do half an hour, 20 minutes, part 1, part 2, but lots more to come, so keep dialing in, and we'll see you soon. Take care, and rock on.
Amp on.
Amp on. I like that.